Welcome to the rugged hills of Laconia in ancient Greece in the year 425 BCE, during the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, when Spartan military power is at its zenith, when the feared hoplite phalanx dominates Greek warfare, but when another dimension of Spartan military practice operates in the shadows, the Crypteia, a secret force of young Spartan warriors trained in stealth, assassination, and nighttime operations that represent a completely different face of Spartan warfare than the legendary battles of open-field combat. For the next few hours, we will explore the forgotten tactics of Spartan nighttime ambushes, examining the historical evidence for Spartan irregular warfare, the training and methods that prepared warriors for operations in darkness, and the brutal reality of a military system that combined the discipline of the phalanx with the ruthlessness of covert operations. If you enjoy these detailed explorations of ancient military tactics and the complexities behind famous warrior cultures, please like and subscribe to support our channel. Our story begins in the Spartan countryside on a moonless night in early autumn, when a young Spartan warrior named Aristodemos moves silently through the darkness, approaching a Helot settlement with the intent to kill. Aristodemos is 19 years old, in his final year of the Adogi, the brutal Spartan training system, and currently participating in the Crypteia, an institution that is part military training, part state terrorism, and entirely secret from non-Spartan eyes. The Crypteia is one of the most disturbing aspects of Spartan society, a practice that ancient sources describe with a mixture of horror and reluctant admiration. According to Plutarch and other ancient writers, selected young Spartans in the final stages of their training are sent into the countryside alone or in small groups, armed only with a dagger, ordered to hide during the day and to emerge at night to kill helots, the enslaved agricultural workers who form the economic foundation of Spartan society. The purpose of the Crypteia is multiple. It provides training in stealth, in survival with minimal equipment, in the psychological hardening required to kill without hesitation. It also serves as a terror tactic to maintain control over the helot population, which outnumbers the Spartans by perhaps 7 or 8 to 1. The constant threat of assassination keeps the helots fearful and compliant, preventing the organized resistance that could threaten Spartan dominance. Aristodemos has been operating in the Crypteia for 3 weeks now, living rough in the hills, hunting for food, avoiding detection during daylight, emerging at night to stalk helot settlements. He has already killed twice, both times helots working alone in fields at dawn or dusk. Vulnerable targets that allowed him to strike and vanish before alarm could be raised. Tonight's target is more ambitious. Intelligence, provided by Spartan overseers who monitor the helot population, indicates that a particular helot named Cleomenes has been speaking words of defiance, encouraging other helots to resist Spartan authority, potentially organizing some form of resistance. Such behavior cannot be tolerated, and Cleomenes has been marked for elimination. Aristodemos approaches the helot village in darkness, moving slowly and carefully, each footstep placed deliberately to avoid making noise. He is dressed entirely in dark clothing, a dark cloak over a dark tunic, his face darkened with soot to avoid the paleness of skin showing in starlight. His only weapon is an iron dagger approximately 12 inches long, designed for stabbing rather than cutting, a weapon suited to silent killing. The Spartan training that has prepared Aristodemos for this work is comprehensive. The Agogi includes extensive training in moving silently, learning to walk on different surfaces without creating noise, learning to control breathing and movement to minimize sound, practicing stalking exercises where young warriors attempt to approach instructors without being detected. The training also includes considerable work on night operations. Spartans drill in darkness, learning to fight and move when vision is limited, developing the ability to navigate by starlight and by terrain features, conditioning themselves to remain alert and effective during nighttime hours when most ancient peoples avoided military operations. Most significantly, the Agogi includes psychological conditioning to make young Spartans capable of violence without hesitation or remorse. The education emphasizes Spartan superiority, dehumanizes enemies and helots, rewards aggression and ruthlessness, and punishes any sign of weakness or compassion. By the time a young Spartan reaches the Crypteia phase of training, he has been thoroughly conditioned to view killing as a normal and acceptable part of his role. Aristodemos reaches the edge of the helot village, a cluster of perhaps 20 crude dwellings made from wood and thatch, housing perhaps 100 helots who work the agricultural lands that support Spartan citizens. The village is dark and quiet, its inhabitants asleep, the only illumination coming from the stars and from the faint glow of embers in a few hearths. He has studied the village's layout during previous observations from the hills during daylight. He knows which dwelling belongs to Cleomenes, a slightly larger structure near the center of the village, distinguishable by its position and by markers he noted during daylight surveillance. Moving with extreme caution, Aristodemos enters the village, staying in the deepest shadows, moving from one pool of darkness to the next. The night is still, no wind to create covering noise, but also no wind to carry sounds of his movement to alert anyone. The silence works both for and against him. He reaches Cleomenes' dwelling and pauses, listening intently for sounds from within. He hears breathing, multiple people sleeping, which is expected, as the dwelling likely houses Cleomenes. His wife, perhaps children or other family members. Aristodemos must enter the dwelling, locate Cleomenes in the darkness, kill him silently, and escape before the household awakens, or before the killing is discovered. The door is a simple wooden barrier, unbarred. Helots have no security beyond what Spartan overseers permit, and elaborate locks or bars would be viewed as suspicious signs of potential resistance. Aristodemos slowly pushes the door open, the hinges creaking slightly, but not loudly enough to wake the sleepers. Inside, the darkness is absolute. Aristodemos stands motionless, allowing his eyes to adjust to the deeper darkness, listening to the pattern of breathing to locate the sleepers. He hears heavy breathing from the far side of the room, likely an adult male, probably Cleomenes. Lighter breathing from another location, probably a woman, and the sound of a child's breathing from a third location. Aristodemos moves toward the heavy breathing, placing each foot carefully, testing the floor before transferring weight to avoid creaking boards or stepping on objects that might make noise. The distance is perhaps 12 feet, but it takes several minutes to cover it safely. He reaches the sleeping form, kneels beside it, can smell the man's body odor, can hear his breathing clearly. This is the moment. Aristodemos has been trained for this, has done it before, knows exactly what to do, but there is still a moment of hesitation. This is a sleeping man, helpless, who will die without ever knowing what struck him. It is murder by any definition, sanctioned and ordered murder, but murder nonetheless. The hesitation lasts perhaps 2 heartbeats. Then Aristodemos' training takes over. His left hand covers the man's mouth, pressing firmly to prevent outcry. His right hand drives the dagger down in a practiced motion, the blade entering just below the ribs, angling upward toward the heart, penetrating deep. The man jerks awake, tries to struggle, but Aristodemos' hand over his mouth prevents screaming, and the dagger wound is rapidly fatal. Within perhaps 30 seconds, the struggling stops, the body goes limp. Cleomenes is dead. Aristodemos remains motionless for several more seconds, listening for any sign that others in the dwelling have awakened. The woman's breathing has changed slightly. She is stirring, but not yet awake. The child continues sleeping. Aristodemos carefully extracts his dagger, wipes it clean on the dead man's clothing, and begins his withdrawal. He moves back toward the door with the same careful silence, exits the dwelling, and disappears into the darkness, moving quickly now to put distance between himself and the village before the killing is discovered. This is the reality of the Crypteia, state-sanctioned assassination carried out by young warriors as part of their training, a practice that reveals a much darker side of Spartan culture than the heroic phalanx battles that dominate popular imagination. The Crypteia made Spartans comfortable with violence, skilled in stealth operations, and psychologically hardened to killing in ways that served them in conventional warfare, but that also made them brutal occupiers and ruthless opponents. As Aristodemos retreats into the hills, seeking a hiding place to wait out the daylight hours before moving to his next objective, he reflects on what he has done. He feels no guilt. The Agoge has trained that out of him, has taught him that helots are inferior, that their lives matter only insofar as they serve Spartan interests, that killing enemies of the state is virtuous service. But he does feel the adrenaline, the intensity of close-quarters violence, the knowledge that he has passed another test of the brutal training system that shapes Spartan warriors. When he completes the Crypteia and returns to Sparta, he will be a full citizen, a peer, a member of the warrior elite that rules Laconia with absolute authority. The Crypteia represents one type of Spartan nighttime operations, assassination and terror tactics directed against the enslaved Helot population. But Spartan nighttime tactics also included military operations against foreign enemies, ambushes of Athenian forces during the Peloponnesian War, and various covert operations that leveraged Spartan training in darkness and stealth. Understanding these forgotten tactics requires looking beyond the famous set-piece battles like Thermopylae and examining the fuller range of Spartan military capabilities. The Spartans were not just heavy infantry who fought in rigid formations, but were also trained in irregular warfare, in adaptation to terrain and circumstance, in psychological operations and ruthless pragmatism that made them formidable opponents in any type of warfare. To understand how Spartans developed the skills for nighttime operations, we must examine the agoge, the comprehensive training system that transformed Spartan boys into warriors. While the agoge is famous for its brutality and rigor, specific aspects of the training specifically prepared Spartans for combat and operations in darkness. Let us step back in time several years and follow Aristodemos through aspects of his training that developed his nighttime combat capabilities, observing the methods and the underlying philosophy that created warriors comfortable with operating in conditions that most ancient armies avoided. When Aristodemos was 12 years old, he participated in one of the agoge's most distinctive training exercises, the nighttime survival test. He and approximately 20 other boys of his age cohort were taken into the rugged hills east of Sparta, given minimal equipment, a single cloak, no food, no weapons beyond a knife, and ordered to survive for 5 days without being captured by the older warriors who would be hunting them. The exercise began at dusk. The boys were given a brief head start, perhaps 30 minutes, to move away from the starting point and to find hiding places before the hunters began pursuit. Aristodemos ran with his group initially, moving quickly through the gathering darkness, but soon realized that moving as a large group made them easier to detect and capture. He separated from the main group, moving alone into rougher terrain where the vegetation was denser and where the rocky ground offered numerous hiding places. This decision reflected understanding already developed through earlier training, that stealth often requires operating alone or in very small groups, that individual initiative is valuable, that the solidarity of the group must sometimes be sacrificed for tactical advantage. As full darkness fell, Aristodemos found a hiding place, a narrow crevice between large rocks, partially concealed by brush, offering both concealment and a defensive position if discovered. Here he spent the first night, hungry and cold, the single cloak providing minimal warmth in the October chill, but safe from detection. The training exercise was designed to develop multiple skills simultaneously. Physical endurance and resilience to cold and hunger, obviously, but also skills specific to nighttime operations, moving through darkness without injury, navigating by stars and by terrain features, finding shelter and concealment, avoiding detection by alert pursuers, maintaining mental focus despite exhaustion and stress. The boys who were captured, and most were captured within the first 2 days, faced punishment upon return. Beatings, reduced food rations, public shaming. The boys who successfully evaded capture for the full 5 days earned praise and increased status within their age cohort. This created powerful motivation to develop effective nighttime survival skills. During that first survival exercise, Aristodemos learned several important lessons. He learned that human eyes adapt to darkness given time, that what initially appears as impenetrable blackness gradually resolves into distinguishable forms and shadows. He learned that sounds carry clearly at night, that he must move with extreme care to avoid creating noise that would reveal his position. He learned to navigate by the stars, identifying constellations that mark directions, noting how they moved across the sky through the night, using them to maintain orientation even in unfamiliar terrain. He learned to identify terrain features by touch and by starlight, to distinguish rock from soil, to feel the grain of wood to identify tree species, to use all his senses when vision was limited. Most importantly, he learned to control fear. Darkness creates psychological challenges, the unknown becomes threatening, imagination conjures dangers, the absence of visual information makes it difficult to assess situations accurately. Young boys, taken from the relative safety of Spartan society, and forced to survive alone in darkness with pursuers hunting them, experienced intense fear. But the training forced them to function despite fear, to make decisions and take actions even when frightened, to maintain combat effectiveness under psychological stress. This psychological conditioning was as important as the physical skills. Warriors who could control fear in darkness would have advantages over enemies who could not. As Aristodemos progressed through the agoge, the nighttime training became more sophisticated and more directly combat-focused. At age 14, he began formal training in night fighting, learning to use weapons in limited visibility, developing techniques for close-quarters combat when opponents could not be clearly seen. The not fighting instruction was conducted by experienced warriors who had themselves mastered these techniques. The training occurred at night, in conditions similar to actual combat. Minimal light, uncertain footing, realistic weapons, though often wooden practice weapons to prevent training injuries. One key technique was learning to fight by sound and feel rather than by sight. Aristodemos practiced listening for the rustle of clothing or equipment that indicated an opponent's position and movement. He learned to sense movement through ground vibrations, heavy footsteps creating tremors that could be felt through the feet. He learned to use peripheral vision, which functions better than direct vision in low-light conditions. The training included specific drills for coordinated small unit actions in darkness. Groups of 4 or 5 young warriors practiced moving together silently, communicating through touch signals rather than voice, maintaining formation despite inability to see clearly. These drills developed the coordination necessary for ambush operations that required multiple warriors to act simultaneously. At age 16, Aristodemos participated in mock ambush exercises that closely simulated actual combat operations. His unit, approximately 30 young warriors, was assigned to ambush another unit of similar size. The exercise occurred at night, in rough terrain, with both sides armed with wooden weapons and wearing light armor. The planning phase revealed the tactical complexity of ambush operations. The ambushing force must select a location offering concealment, must position themselves to achieve surprise, must coordinate the timing of their attack to maximize impact. They must also plan for the aftermath, how to withdraw if the ambush fails, how to pursue if it succeeds, how to respond to various contingencies. Aristodemos' unit selected an ambush position along a trail through a narrow valley, concealing themselves among rocks and vegetation on both sides of the trail. They spent hours waiting in absolute silence, muscles cramping from remaining motionless, constantly fighting the urge to shift position or make noise. This waiting was itself important training, learning to endure discomfort and boredom while remaining alert and ready for instant action. When the target unit finally approached, moving in column along the trail, the ambush was sprung with a whistle signal. Aristodemos and his companions rushed from concealment, attacking the surprised target unit from both sides simultaneously, the wooden weapons striking with force that would have been lethal if they had been real. The target unit attempted to form a defensive formation, but in darkness and surprise, coordination was impossible. Within minutes, the exercise was called to a halt by the observing instructors, with the ambushing force declared the winners, having killed or captured most of the target unit before they could organize effective resistance. The debrief afterward emphasized the principles that made the ambush successful: careful position selection, absolute silence and discipline while waiting, coordinated simultaneous attack from multiple directions, and the psychological impact of surprise. These principles, learned through repeated exercises, became ingrained knowledge that Spartan warriors could apply in actual combat. Another aspect of nighttime combat training was learning to use terrain features to advantage in darkness. Spartans trained extensively in the rough terrain around Sparta: hills, valleys, streams, rocky outcrops, learning how to move through this terrain in all conditions, including darkness. They learned which terrain features provided good ambush positions, which offered good routes for rapid movement, which were obstacles to avoid. They learned how terrain channeled movement, how valleys and passes forced enemies into predictable routes, how steep slopes limited tactical options, how streams and rivers created natural boundaries. This terrain knowledge was combined with map reading of a sort, not maps in the modern cartographic sense, but memorized knowledge of the landscape, mental models of terrain features and their relationships, the ability to visualize terrain and to plan routes and positions without needing written or drawn representations. The training also included what we might call environmental awareness, learning to interpret signs in the environment that indicated human presence. Disturbed vegetation that suggested someone had passed recently. The smell of cooking fires or animal corrals that indicated nearby settlements. The sound of livestock or domestic activities that revealed inhabited areas. Birds and animal behavior that suggested disturbance by human activity. This environmental reading allowed Spartan warriors to gather intelligence about enemy positions and movements, to detect ambushes before walking into them, to locate targets for their own ambush operations. It was a form of tactical intelligence gathering that required no sophisticated technology, only trained observation and interpretation. By the time Aristodemus reached age 18 and entered the final phases of the agoge, he had accumulated hundreds of hours of nighttime operations training. Survival exercises, combat drills, ambush practice, terrain navigation, environmental awareness, psychological conditioning to fear and stress. This training made him capable of operations that would have been impossible for warriors from other Greek city-states who lacked such specialized preparation. The sophistication of this training system is remarkable for its time period. The Spartans had developed a systematic curriculum for nighttime combat operations centuries before such training became standard in modern military forces. They understood the importance of psychological preparation, of repeated practice under realistic conditions, of progression from basic to advanced skills. But we should also recognize the dark purposes this training served. The skills developed through nighttime combat training were used not only in legitimate warfare against foreign enemies, but also in the brutal repression of the Helot population, in assassination and terror tactics that maintained Spartan dominance through fear. The same skills that made Spartans effective night fighters also made them effective at what we would today recognize as state terrorism and crimes against humanity. While the Cryptia represented domestic terror operations against Helots, Spartan nighttime ambush tactics were also employed against foreign military targets during actual warfare. Let us examine a military ambush operation during the Peloponnesian War, observing how Spartan training translated into combat effectiveness against professional opponents. It is now 424 BCE, and Aristodemus is 20 years old, a full Spartan citizen and warrior, participating in his first major campaign against Athenian forces. The strategic situation has Spartan forces operating in Boeotia, attempting to intercept and destroy an Athenian force that is raiding Spartan allied territory. A Spartan commander named Brasidas, one of the most capable Spartan generals of the era, known for aggressive tactics and willingness to fight at night when most commanders avoided battle, has obtained intelligence that an Athenian supply column will be moving through a particular mountain pass tonight, attempting to reach an Athenian-controlled fort before daybreak.
Brasidas decides to ambush this column, using a picked force of 60 Spartans trained in nighttime operations. Aristodemus is selected for this force based on his Cryptia experience and his demonstrated skills in night fighting during training.
The plan is straightforward, but requires precise execution. The Spartan force will conceal themselves along both sides of the pass through which the Athenian column must travel. They will allow the column to enter fully into the pass, then attack from both sides simultaneously, blocking escape routes and overwhelming the Athenians through surprise and superior position. The operation begins in late afternoon, with the Spartan force moving to the selected ambush position, a narrow section of the pass where rocky slopes on both sides rise steeply, creating a confined space where the Athenians will be unable to deploy or maneuver effectively.
Brasidas personally inspects the position, checking sightlines, verifying that his force can remain concealed,
identifying the exact locations where his men will hide. He divides the force into 2 groups of 30, one for each side of the pass, and assigns specific positions to each warrior. Aristodemus is positioned on the northern side of the pass, concealed among rocks, approximately 20 feet above the trail. His specific assignment is to watch for the column's approach, and to give the attack signal when Brasidas judges the timing optimal. As dusk falls and darkness deepens, the Spartan force settles into position. Absolute silence is enforced. Brasidas has made clear that any noise that might alert the Athenians will be punished severely. The warriors remain motionless, weapons ready, watching the eastern approach from which the column will come. The Athenian column is moving slower than expected, or perhaps the intelligence about their departure time was incorrect. The Spartans wait patiently, accustomed to such delays from their training, maintaining discipline despite the discomfort of remaining still in cold darkness. Finally, around midnight, Aristodemos sees movement in the distance, dark shapes moving along the trail, the sound of footsteps and equipment. The Athenian column is approaching. He can hear them clearly now, perhaps 50 men moving in loose column formation, talking among themselves, making no particular effort at silence. They are carrying supplies. He can hear the sounds of packs and bundles, the clink of pottery and metal goods. They appear to have no advanced scouts, no security element, no expectation of danger. This is both opportunity and contempt. Opportunity because the Athenians' lack of tactical security makes ambush easier. Contempt because it demonstrates that the Athenians view nighttime movement through allied territory as safe, that they don't fear Spartan night operations, that they have underestimated their enemy. The Athenian column enters the pass, the lead elements passing directly below Aristodemos' position. He can see them now in the starlight, men in light armor, carrying spears and shields, burdened with packs and bundles. They look tired, focused on the trail, completely unaware of the warriors concealed on the slopes above them. Brasidas waits for the optimal moment, when the entire column is fully committed to the pass, when the lead and rear elements are both within the ambush zone, when withdrawal in either direction would be difficult. Then he gives the signal, a sharp whistle that cuts through the night. Instantly, 60 Spartans rise from concealment and attack. Aristodemos launches himself down the slope, spear held ready, targeting the nearest Athenian. The Athenians have perhaps 2 seconds of warning, the whistle, the sound of movement from the slopes, before the Spartans crash into them. The combat is chaotic and brutal. The Athenians, surprised and disorganized, attempt to form some kind of defensive position, but in darkness and confined space, coordination is impossible. The Spartans attack from higher ground, using gravity to add force to their spear thrusts, striking down into the packed Athenian formation. Aristodemos' spear strikes an Athenian in the shoulder, the force driving the man to his knees. Aristodemos recovers the spear and thrusts again, this time striking the fallen man's back, killing him. Around him, other Spartans are similarly engaging, their training and coordination allowing them to fight effectively despite the darkness, while the Athenians struggle to respond. The specific techniques developed through Spartan night fighting training become evident. The Spartans maintain awareness of each other's positions despite limited visibility, avoiding striking their own men. They listen for sounds of Athenian movement and respond to threats they cannot clearly see. They use their shields not just for defense, but as weapons, smashing Athenian warriors and breaking their formations. The Athenian resistance is brave but ineffective. Some attempt to form a shield wall, but in the confined space and darkness, the formation is ragged and easily broken. Others attempt to flee, but the Spartans have blocked both ends of the pass, and attempting to climb the steep slopes in darkness is nearly impossible. Within perhaps 10 minutes, an eternity in combat but objectively a short time, the ambush has achieved its objectives. The majority of the Athenian force is dead or captured. A few have escaped by scrambling up the slopes, or by somehow breaking through the Spartan blocking positions, but the supply column has been destroyed, its supplies captured, its mission failed. The Spartan casualties are minimal, 3 men wounded, none killed. The asymmetry reflects the advantage of ambush, the value of surprise and superior position, and the effectiveness of training specifically designed for nighttime combat. As dawn approaches, Brasidas orders his force to withdraw, taking the captured supplies and leaving the Athenian dead where they fell. The Spartans move quickly through the darkness, navigating by familiar routes. Returning to their main force before daylight makes them vulnerable to Athenian retaliation. This operation demonstrates several key aspects of Spartan nighttime ambush tactics in military contexts. First, the Spartans were willing to fight at night when most Greek armies avoided night operations. This willingness gave them tactical options unavailable to opponents who restricted operations to daylight hours. Second, Spartan night fighting required careful planning and coordination. Brasidas selected the ambush site based on terrain analysis, positioned his forces for maximum effect, waited for optimal timing before attacking, The operation succeeded because of planning as much as because of combat skills. Third, the training that prepared Spartans for night combat provided decisive advantages in actual combat. The Spartans' ability to fight effectively in darkness, to maintain coordination when visibility was limited, to navigate terrain at night, these capabilities, developed through years of training, translated directly into combat effectiveness. Fourth, surprise multiplied the effect of Spartan tactical advantages. Even well-trained opponents are vulnerable when surprised, and nighttime operations magnify the shock and confusion of surprise attack. Fifth, night operations aligned with Spartan strategic preferences for decisive action and for minimizing their own casualties while inflicting maximum damage on enemies. Ambush tactics allowed small Spartan forces to achieve results disproportionate to their numbers, preserving Spartan manpower, always the scarce resource given Sparta's small citizen population. Historical accounts from the Peloponnesian War and other conflicts record numerous instances of Spartan night operations, ambushes, surprise attacks on camps, interception of supply convoys, covert infiltrations. While these operations are less famous than the great hoplite battles, they were important components of Spartan military effectiveness and demonstrate the full spectrum of Spartan tactical capabilities. Beyond the direct tactical advantages of nighttime operations, Spartans also understood and exploited the psychological dimensions of night combat. The fear that darkness creates, the terror of invisible enemies, the demoralization of forces that feel unsafe even in their own camps. Let us examine how Spartans employed psychological warfare and terror tactics during nighttime operations, both against military enemies and as tools of social control. During the later phases of the Peloponnesian War, Spartan forces under commanders like Brasidas and Lysander deliberately cultivated reputations for ruthlessness and for willingness to strike at any time, including at night when enemies felt relatively safe. This reputation itself became a weapon, creating anxiety and fear that degraded enemy effectiveness. Consider the situation of an Athenian force encamped in hostile territory, knowing that Spartan units are operating in the area. The Athenians must maintain constant vigilance, posting sentries, organizing guard rotations, remaining armed and ready to respond to attacks. But this constant readiness is exhausting, especially when extended over days or weeks. The psychological burden is particularly heavy at night. Every sound in the darkness could be an approaching Spartan force. Every movement glimpsed at the edge of vision could be a scout or infiltrator. The guards stare into the darkness, imagination converting shadows into enemies, creating false alarms that disrupt sleep and keep the camp on edge. The Spartans understood this dynamic and exploited it. Even when not planning actual attacks, Spartan forces would sometimes conduct harassment operations designed purely to create psychological stress, sending small groups to approach enemy camps at night, making noise to alert sentries, then withdrawing before contact. These operations accomplished no direct tactical objective, but achieved the psychological objective of preventing enemy rest and creating cumulative stress. The ancient writer Thucydides describes Spartan night operations during the siege of Plataea, where Spartan forces repeatedly probed the Plataean defenses at night, preventing the defenders from resting, creating constant anxiety about when and where the next attack would come. While the Spartans eventually took Plataea through prolonged siege rather than through night assault, the nighttime harassment contributed to defender exhaustion and demoralization. Another psychological dimension of Spartan night operations was the selective use of extreme violence to create deterrent effects. The Crypteia assassinations served this purpose domestically. The Helots knew that speaking against Spartan authority or attempting to organize resistance could result in sudden death delivered without warning in the night. This knowledge maintained Helot compliance more effectively than constant overt violence would have. Similarly, in military contexts, Spartans sometimes made examples of captured enemies, particularly those who had resisted effectively or who represented specific categories that Spartans wished to deter. The execution methods were sometimes public and deliberately brutal, designed to create fear among potential resistors. This calculated cruelty served strategic objectives. If enemy forces believed that surrender meant torture or execution, they might fight more desperately. But if they believed that surrender would be accepted with reasonable treatment, while resistance would lead to terrible consequences, they might choose surrender more readily. the Spartans calibrated their treatment of enemies to create the behavioral incentives they desired. The psychological training of Spartan warriors also included elements we would today recognize as conditioning against enemy psychological operations. Spartans were trained to maintain composure when facing threatening situations, to control fear responses, to function effectively, even when frightened or under severe stress. This training began early in the agoge. Young boys were deliberately exposed to frightening situations, darkness, isolation, simulated danger, and required to function despite fear. They were taught that showing fear was shameful, that courage was expected, that Spartan warriors mastered fear rather than being mastered by it. The physical component of this training was complemented by ideological conditioning. Spartan culture emphasized values like honor, glory, and the nobility of death in battle. Warriors were taught that dying for Sparta was the highest achievement, that returning victorious or dying in combat were the only acceptable outcomes, that surrender or cowardice were unthinkable disgraces. This ideology served practical functions. Warriors who genuinely believed death in battle was glorious were less vulnerable to fear-based psychological operations. Soldiers who viewed surrender as unthinkable would fight more tenaciously. Forces that valued honor above survival were more difficult to demoralize. But the ideology also created significant costs. The Spartan obsession with honor and glory contributed to tactical inflexibility in some situations. Commanders sometimes rejected sound tactical retreats because they viewed withdrawal as dishonorable. Warriors sometimes took unnecessary risks to demonstrate courage, resulting in casualties that could have been avoided through more prudent tactics. The treatment of Spartans who failed to meet cultural expectations reveals the dark side of this psychological conditioning. Spartans who survived battles where their units were destroyed, who retreated when cultural norms demanded they fight to the death, who showed cowardice in any form, such men faced social destruction. Historical accounts describe the Trasantes, Spartans who had shown cowardice in battle, being stripped of citizen rights, forced to wear distinguishing marks on their clothing, excluded from communal dining and social activities, essentially made social pariahs. The shame was so severe that some Trasantes committed suicide rather than endure it. This treatment served as powerful negative reinforcement, creating intense pressure to meet Spartan warrior ideals regardless of circumstances. But it also created tragic outcomes, punishing individuals for sometimes unavoidable failures, inflicting lifelong shame for momentary lapses under extreme stress. The psychological dimension of Spartan night operations extended to information control and deception operations. Spartans were notoriously secretive about their methods and capabilities, deliberately cultivating mystery around their training and tactics. This secrecy enhanced the psychological impact. Enemies facing unknowable threats experienced greater anxiety than those facing well-understood dangers. Spartans also employed deception to create confusion and uncertainty. They would sometimes conduct obvious movements that suggested one intention, while actually planning different operations. They would spread false information about their plans and capabilities. They would use double agents and captured enemies to feed misinformation to opponents. These deception operations often incorporated nighttime activities. A force might march openly during the day in one direction, then march secretly at night in a different direction to achieve surprise. Decoy camps might be established and maintained with fires and activity, while the main force operated elsewhere. False intelligence might be planted, suggesting that Spartans lacked capability for night operations, luring enemies into false security. The sophistication of these psychological and deception operations indicates that Spartans understood warfare as more than just physical combat. They recognized that the human mind was as important a battlefield as physical terrain, that fear and confusion could be as effective as spears and shields, that psychological effects could multiply the impact of limited forces. This understanding influenced their approach to night operations. Nighttime attacks were chosen not just for tactical advantages, but for psychological impact. The horror of being attacked in darkness, the vulnerability of being caught sleeping, the chaos of trying to organize defense when unable to see clearly. These psychological effects were as valuable as the tactical advantages of surprise.
Having examined the training, tactics, and psychological dimensions of Spartan nighttime operations, let us now explore the practical equipment and specific methods that Spartans employed during night operations.
grounding our understanding in the material realities of ancient warfare. The equipment Spartans used for night operations was adapted from their standard military equipment, but with modifications and specialized items suited to darkness operations. Let us examine these items and their uses in detail. The primary weapon for nighttime operations was the dory, the standard Spartan spear, approximately 7 to 9 feet long, with a bronze or iron spearhead and a bronze butt spike. This weapon was suitable for both phalanx combat and for individual fighting, providing reach that was valuable in darkness when closing to sword range increased vulnerability. However, for close quarters work in darkness, particularly for assassination operations like the Crypteia, Spartans also carried the xiphos, a short sword approximately 2 feet in blade length, designed for stabbing thrusts rather than cutting. This weapon was effective in confined spaces and in grappling situations where the longer spear would be unwieldy. For stealth operations, warriors often carried a specialized longer dagger or short sword called an enchiridion, approximately 12 to 18 inches in blade length, designed specifically for silent killing. This weapon appears in ancient sources describing assassinations and covert operations, though its exact form and characteristics are debated by modern scholars. Armor for night operations presented a trade-off between protection and stealth. The standard Spartan panoply included a bronze breastplate, or later, a composite corselet of linen and bronze greaves protecting the shins, and a bronze helmet. But this armor was heavy, perhaps 40 pounds total, and created noise when moving. For stealth operations, Spartans often reduced their armor, wearing lighter protection or sometimes operating with minimal armor to maximize mobility and minimize noise. Historical accounts mention Spartans on covert missions wearing dark cloaks with minimal armor underneath, prioritizing stealth over protection. The famous Spartan shield, the aspis, approximately 3 feet in diameter, made from wood covered with bronze, was essential for phalanx combat, but was awkward for stealth operations. The shield was heavy and unwieldy when moving through rough terrain in darkness. For many night operations, particularly small unit ambushes or infiltrations, Spartans left their shields behind or carried smaller, lighter shields that provided some protection without the bulk of the full aspis. Spartans relied on natural light sources, stars and moon when available, and on torches when stealth was not required. Torches were made from wood wrapped with resinous materials, or from bundles of dry grass or reeds soaked in oil or pitch. These provided light, but also created smoke and consumed oxygen, limiting their usefulness in enclosed spaces. For operations requiring both light and stealth, Spartans sometimes used shielded lanterns, enclosed oil lamps with shutters that could be opened to emit light or closed to conceal it. These allowed controlled illumination that could be concealed from enemies while providing light for critical moments. Navigational equipment for night operations was minimal. Spartans navigated primarily by terrain knowledge, by stars, and by following known routes. They did not have compasses or sophisticated maps. Navigation was a learned skill rather than a technology-dependent capability. For communication during nighttime operations, Spartans used a combination of methods. Verbal communication was avoided when stealth was required, so silent signals were employed. Touch signals to communicate with immediately adjacent warriors. Visual signals using hand gestures or movements, visible in starlight for slightly longer ranges, and occasionally coded sounds, specific whistles or animal calls that could be used to coordinate action or to communicate simple messages. The training included learning these signal systems and practicing their use until communication became automatic. Warriors learned to interpret touch signals through thick cloaks and armor, to recognize visual signals in minimal light, to distinguish coded sounds from natural noises. For marking routes or positions during darkness, Spartans sometimes used physical markers, stones arranged in specific patterns, branches broken or placed in particular ways, scratches on rocks or trees. These markers allowed warriors to follow routes or to locate specific positions, even in complete darkness, by feeling for the markers. Timing operations in darkness presented challenges. Without accurate timekeeping devices, Spartans relied on natural indicators, star positions, moon phases, the progression of the night from dusk to dawn. Experienced warriors learned to estimate time by observing celestial movements, allowing reasonably accurate coordination of timed actions. The practical methods of executing night ambushes followed patterns developed through training and refined through experience. A typical ambush operation involved several distinct phases. First, reconnaissance and planning, identifying the target, studying its likely route and timing, selecting the ambush position based on terrain analysis and tactical objectives, determining force size and composition, assigning specific roles and positions to each warrior. Second, movement to position, traveling to the ambush site, often during daylight or evening twilight, to avoid navigation difficulties, using routes that avoided detection, arriving with sufficient time to prepare positions before the target's expected arrival. Third, position preparation, concealing warriors in their assigned positions, ensuring they had good fields of fire or attack routes, arranging for coordinated action, establishing signals for initiating the ambush, preparing withdrawal routes. Fourth, waiting, maintaining absolute silence and stillness, often for hours, enduring discomfort and boredom while remaining alert, watching for the target's approach, maintaining readiness for instant action. Fifth, execution, initiating the ambush at the optimal moment with coordinated simultaneous action, overwhelming the target through surprise and superior position, maintaining aggression to prevent organized resistance. Sixth, exploitation, killing or capturing enemies, seizing equipment or supplies, collecting intelligence from prisoners or captured documents, destroying or removing anything of value to the enemy. Seventh, withdrawal, leaving the ambush site before enemy reinforcements could arrive, moving to secure positions, conducting after-action assessment, treating casualties, reporting results to higher command. Each phase required specific skills and careful execution. Mistakes in any phase could compromise the entire operation. Poor reconnaissance might select an ineffective ambush position. Noisy movement to position might alert enemies. Inadequate concealment might allow detection before the ambush could be sprung. Premature initiation might allow enemies to escape. Inadequate exploitation might waste the tactical success. The emphasis on methodical execution and on detailed planning reflects Spartan military culture more broadly. Despite stereotypes of Spartans as mindless warriors, historical evidence suggests they were actually quite thoughtful about tactics and operations. Willing to employ sophisticated methods when appropriate, combining careful planning with aggressive execution.
As we conclude our exploration of Spartan nighttime ambush tactics, let us examine what historical evidence actually tells us about these practices, what remains uncertain or debated, and what lessons we can derive from studying this forgotten aspect of Spartan warfare. The historical evidence for Spartan night operations comes from several types of sources, each with strengths and limitations. Ancient historians like Thucydides, Xenophon, himself a student of Spartan methods and an admirer of Spartan military effectiveness, and Plutarch provide accounts of specific operations and descriptions of Spartan practices. These sources are valuable, but require critical reading. They were written with biases, often emphasized dramatic or unusual events over routine practices, and sometimes included legendary or exaggerated elements. Archaeological evidence provides some material confirmation, weapons and equipment that would have been used in night operations, fortifications that show evidence of attacks, burial sites with remains showing wounds consistent with ambush attacks. But archaeological evidence rarely provides detailed tactical information, limiting its utility for understanding specific methods. Comparative evidence from other military cultures helps fill gaps, examining how other ancient armies conducted night operations, how traditional warriors in various cultures developed similar tactics, how modern special operations forces employ analogous techniques. This comparative analysis must be done carefully to avoid assuming that Spartans necessarily did things the same way others did, but it can suggest plausible reconstructions where direct evidence is lacking. The Crypteia, the secret institution we discussed in our opening segment, is particularly problematic from an evidentiary standpoint. Ancient sources describe it, but details are sparse and sometimes contradictory. Modern scholars debate whether the Crypteia was primarily a training institution, a terror mechanism, or some combination. We know it existed, the sources are too consistent for it to be entirely fabricated, but exact details of how it operated remain uncertain. Some modern scholars argue that accounts of the Crypteia are exaggerated, that it was less brutal than ancient sources suggest, that it primarily served training purposes rather than being a systematic assassination program. Others argue that the sources should be taken seriously,
that the Crypteia was indeed as brutal as described, that it reflects the deeply militarized and ruthless nature of Spartan society. The truth likely falls somewhere in the middle. The Crypteia probably did involve helot assassinations, as the sources describe, but perhaps not as systematically or as extensively as the most extreme accounts suggest. It served both training and terror purposes, developing skills while also maintaining social control. What is clear from the evidence is that Spartans were willing and able to conduct effective nighttime operations against military targets. Multiple ancient accounts describe Spartan night attacks, ambushes, and covert operations. These accounts are consistent enough and come from diverse enough sources that we can be confident the basic capability existed, even if specific tactical details remain uncertain. The training system we've described is based on ancient accounts of the agoge, combined with logical inference about what training would be necessary to develop observed capabilities. We know the agoge was rigorous and comprehensive. We know it produced warriors capable of nighttime operations. The specific training methods we've described are plausible reconstructions based on these knowns, though details may differ from historical reality. The psychological and cultural dimensions we've explored, the emphasis on honor, the social punishment of cowardice, the psychological conditioning to violence, the strategic use of terror, these are well documented in ancient sources and appear to be accurate characterizations of Spartan culture, though individual Spartans certainly varied in how they internalized and expressed these values. What lessons can we derive from studying Spartan nighttime tactics? Several stand out. First, training and preparation are force multipliers. The Spartans' willingness to invest in extensive training for nighttime operations gave them capabilities that enemies lacked, allowing them to achieve tactical effects disproportionate to their numbers. This principle remains valid. Specialized training creates specialized capabilities. Second, psychological factors are as important as physical factors in warfare. The Spartans understood that creating fear, maintaining morale, controlling information, and exploiting enemy psychological vulnerabilities were crucial to military effectiveness. Modern military forces similarly emphasize psychological operations and information warfare. Third, tactical flexibility and willingness to operate outside conventional norms provide advantages. Most ancient Greek armies fought primarily in daylight using phalanx formations. Spartans could do this, but also could conduct night operations, use irregular tactics, adapt to circumstances. This flexibility made them more effective than more rigid opponents. Fourth, cultural values profoundly influence military effectiveness. Spartan culture emphasized discipline, courage, endurance, and collective action, values that translated directly into military advantages. But these same cultural values also created rigidities and dysfunctions that limited Spartan effectiveness in some contexts. Fifth, specialized capabilities often serve problematic purposes. The skills that made Spartans effective at night ambushes also made them effective at terrorizing helots. Special operations capabilities can be used for legitimate military purposes or for state terrorism and war crimes. Technology and technique are morally neutral. Their ethical status depends on how they are employed. We should also recognize what Spartan practices cannot teach us. The Spartan system was sustainable only because it rested on helot slavery, a vast enslaved population that did the agricultural and artisan work that supported the Spartan warrior class. Without helot labor, the intensive military training that created Spartan capabilities would have been impossible. The Spartan system also ultimately failed. Sparta's inflexible social system, its declining citizen population, its inability to adapt to changing military technologies and tactics, its dependence on helot labor that created constant internal security threats, all of these contributed to Sparta's eventual decline and loss of power. By the time of the Roman conquest of Greece, Sparta was a minor power, its legendary military prowess a memory, its social system an archaic curiosity. The Spartans who had once dominated Greek warfare had become a tourist attraction, performing demonstrations of ancient customs for Roman visitors. This decline reminds us that military effectiveness is always contextual and temporary. What works in one era may not work in another. Systems that produce short-term military advantages may create long-term vulnerabilities. Excessive militarization can undermine the very society it claims to protect. For modern readers interested in military history and tactics, the study of Spartan nighttime operations offers insights into a different approach to warfare, into techniques that were sophisticated for their time, into the relationship between training, culture, and military effectiveness. But it also offers cautionary lessons about the costs of militarization, about the ethical problems created by some military practices, about the limits of military power as a solution to complex social and political challenges. The forgotten tactics of Spartan nighttime ambushes. The stealth approaches, the silent killing, the terror operations, the psychological warfare. These represent a complete different dimension of Spartan warfare than the famous phalanx battles that dominate popular imagination. Understanding these forgotten tactics provides a fuller picture of Spartan military capabilities and of the brutal realities of ancient Greek warfare. As we conclude our exploration, we can appreciate the sophistication of Spartan methods, while also recognizing their deeply problematic nature. The Spartans developed impressive tactical capabilities through systematic training and ruthless cultural conditioning. But they employed these capabilities in service of a militaristic slave society that caused enormous suffering and that ultimately proved unsustainable. The historical study of military practices must include both tactical analysis, understanding how things were done, and ethical assessment, evaluating whether they should have been done and what consequences followed. The Spartan nighttime tactics we've explored exemplify both the remarkable human capacity for developing specialized skills and the troubling purposes to which those skills can be directed. In examining these forgotten tactics, we recover a part of the historical record that is often overlooked. We gain insights into the full spectrum of ancient Greek warfare, and we are reminded that behind every military system, no matter how legendary, lies a complex reality of training, tactics, cultural values, and human choices that created both impressive capabilities and significant costs.